Well, greetings everybody. Welcome to our second lecture, which is our third class. We had an introductory discussion for the first class, and this is now the second lecture, which is on the history of international criminal justice. So I'm excited to talk to you about the history of international criminal justice. It's a subject that I've worked on for a number of years, most recently, and I can't tell you how fascinating this history is. It's so interesting. I'm hoping that you find aspects of it equally stimulating. Here's a little overview of what I hope to go through with you in the next hour before our conversation. So I hope in the next hour and a half that through this particular lecture and then also through our discussion that you emerge with an understanding of the historical evolution of international criminal law to the modern day. I hope you understand how Western influences have dominated the construction of international criminal law, both in terms of substance and in terms of institutional development. And one of the things that I really wanted to encourage you to begin to think about throughout this process is the sort of onion factor I mentioned in the previous lecture, and that is the sort of interlinkages between these sorts of topics. The more you can create connections between the different lectures and topics that were discussed, the more I think you'll learn about the subject, and the richer your understanding will be for whatever reasons that you're interested in engaging with international criminal justice. So I encourage you to start thinking already about the connections between this particular class and the history of international criminal law and the problems that we discussed in the last lecture about how to define the field and what that means. So I wanted to give you a very brief overview of the reading for today. In a way, I'm hoping that you had a chance to read my transcripts of my lectures at the Collège de France, which are also on the history of international criminal justice. I assigned those for the previous lecture, but obviously they're especially germane now. And a section that interests you most about the history of international criminal justice in the article that I wrote with Asad Kiani on the ahistoricism of legal pluralism. I thought I would indicate a little bit about how the article came about, just to sort of give you a little bit more context. The article came about through a debate I was having with some other colleagues in Leiden University. And the debate was about the relationship between universalism in international criminal law and legal pluralism. So universalism is the idea, well, actually we should have uniform standards for some aspects of international criminal law, at least. And I was arguing that notions of complicity should be more universalized, that they're kind of all over the place and it depends on which jurisdiction you're looking at. I told you the story about Van Anrat in the last class, and I guess a part of my inspiration was out of a concern that ultimately Van Anrat's guilt or innocence turned on a relatively arbitrary choice of which notion of complicity the court would adopt, whether it was sort of one of the international variations of complicity or whether it was Dutch concepts of complicity. And that struck me as problematic. As I mentioned, I'm also really interested in and have worked on for a long time the relationship between commerce and atrocity. And so if we're thinking about sort of using international criminal justice to do something fairly ambitious, like regulate as best we can the global supply and weaponry, then it seems to me that universal standards prevent against races to the bottom. At any rate, there are big problems with universalism because it's usually a proxy for sort of Western-dominated standards and has been used in those sorts of ways for a long period of time. So the argument was always pretty provocative. But the counter argument was something that I that inspired me to sort of start thinking about the relationship between colonialism and criminal law, which is sort of infused within the article that I asked you to read for today. And the response is, well, actually, no, it's good that we have various different iterations of international criminal law. You'll remember in the last class that I talked about how, in actual fact, there isn't one monolithic concept of international criminal justice. That in actual fact, there are multiple, because international criminal justice exists in different ways, shapes, and forms by institution, and also because international criminal justice is often incorporated into national legal systems that define it differently based on national law. So a lot of the counter-argument was that, oh, well, it's good that we have these different iterations of international criminal justice because they reflect the sort of different values within each of the different polities that have created different iterations of international criminal law. So that Australia has created a different set of norms that apply to international crimes through its International Crimes Act is a good thing, because it sort of gives states the ability to sort of construct international criminal law in a way that reflects their own values and ways of understanding and being and so on and so forth. And so part of the article emerged as an attempt to tell the history of international criminal justice, but to tell that history in a way that was about the forced imposition of legal standards that international criminal justice absorbs again. So you'll remember I spoke to you about an incident in practice where one of my colleagues banged his fist on the desk and says, oh, I'm not going to participate in this that violates the principle of culpability, which turns out to be a very foundational notion in German criminal law that I'd never heard about it. And often in practice, it's sort of a push and pull of different criminal law traditions trying to gain ascendancy. So at the moment, the International Criminal Court is dominated by German notions of criminal law. Previously, it was Anglo-American. In other forms of, in the Yugoslav Tribunal, for instance, was dominated by Anglo-American concepts of criminal law. There's a sort of a battle for ascendance of those sorts of ideas, and an intellectual debate about which is preferable for the idiosyncrasies of international criminal law. And part of the purpose of this article was to say, you know, when you try and look at when you take these surveys of principles that apply in criminal law throughout the world, don't forget that the vast majority of them were imposed through colonialism and don't necessarily reflect the values of different communities that you're trying to promote. So there's that aspect to it, and I thought I would introduce by mentioning that, but then actually to explore some of the history of each of the iterations that I address. I think the histories are very interesting, and I want to say a little bit about each of them and then sort of lay a foundation for us such that we can speak about them more meaningfully in a moment via Zoom. So let me give you a very brief overview. So I'm going to actually put the whole screen on, and then I can speak to them one by one. So the Lieber Code of 1863 is an important document for a number of reasons. Francis Lieber was a German-American who had sons fighting on both sides of the American Civil War and was commissioned by Abraham Lincoln to write a code that would put in writing what the customary rules of warfare were at the time that were binding on both parties. And that's sort of an interesting technique, and it sort of posits the existence of customary international law and attempts to codify international criminal law, which really represent a theme that we'll see right the way through international criminal law, all the way to the International Criminal Court. This relationship between sort of customary, non-written international law and treaty-based law, or codified law as represented in the Lieber Code. What's significant about the Lieber Code already is that it references criminal responsibility for a range of different acts. And so already from 1863, there's a notion of both prohibitions on the use of certain types of violence, certain types of warfare, and a notion that certain of those violations would be punishable through individual criminal responsibility. The next thing that I wanted to mention to you, which I think is also extremely interesting, repeated attempts to create an international criminal court. And in a way, what you'll see, I hope emerges through the course of these lectures, is that I think in this field, people tend to fixate a little bit too much on the International Criminal Court. It's never really been the central focus of my interest in international criminal justice. I'm much more interested in national trials, in national courts. But nonetheless, I want to talk to you about a key dynamic about why an international criminal justice, why an international criminal court was perceived and remains perceived as necessary. And it's a simple dynamic, but one that I hope will trouble you throughout the course of our time together. And the simple dynamic is that our experience of atrocity is that often those in power who carry them out are able to insulate themselves from accountability within their own national systems. Maybe that goes without saying, but let me insist on it because I think it really is a spectacular problem at the heart of a lot of what we will be describing. To say it, I guess, in a more simple way, if you're able to commit mass atrocities, usually you control law enforcement. Usually you control both the police and the courts and the judges. And that's a problem because once you've carried out this mass violence, prospects of getting any of the people who supported you doing it to hold you accountable are politically nil. Let me say that a third way, which I think really, I hope is unsettling in a constructive way to your thinking about the relationship between lawyers, law, and atrocity. Another way of saying that is that law is often, if not invariably, often indispensable in carrying out atrocities. What better way to carry out atrocities than to harness the police and judges in bringing it about? And in a way, what a spectacular case that we will get to in just a moment, that I hope you will watch in Judgment in Nuremberg. What a spectacular idea that is so totally mind-blowing that you would put the judges in Nazi Germany on trial. Wow. What a moment where you set international criminal justice against the law enforced by judges in Germany. But herein is something, let me circle back before we get to that case. Let me circle back to this idea that the central problem is if you've got enough power to carry out mass violence against certain minority groups, people with disabilities, homosexuals, and so on and so forth, if you've got enough power to do that, you generally have the police and judges, i.e. law enforcement, captured. They are usually helping you do that. And so the prospect of actually sort of holding people accountable through national systems is often illusory. It only becomes possible in national systems at a moment of political transition. Hence the idea of transitional justice. It only becomes possible once there is a new government in place, and that new government says, what happened in the previous government when people were being thrown out of planes, forcibly disappeared and being thrown out of planes. We cannot let that go unpunished. That was too transgressive. We can't possibly let that go unpunished. What would that do to the fabric of society moving forward? What would leaving that unaddressed, what would letting them get away with it mean for the future of our society and the way people think about fairness and justice and rule of law and other things? And so the transitional moment is often key as a way out of the fact that law enforcement is often pretty much captured by those carrying out atrocities. Another way out is to create an international court, or at least another perceived way out of that dynamic is to create an international criminal court. An international criminal court that is capable of generating far more political pressure from an external objective perspective in descents into totalitarianism and mass violence. And that is available to be collecting evidence while this takes place, and that can sit as an objective arbiter of previously warring factions. So if you have an international criminal court, it can adjudicate between Germany and Britain about a whole series of sort of allegations of mass violence on both parts. And this can ensure the humanization of violence, that violence isn't unnecessarily brutal, that if wars are going to happen, we'll let wars happen potentially. But if they do happen, we won't be so focused. If they do happen, we will try and make them as minimally violent as possible. So everything that's unnecessary and just like gratuitous violence will be criminalized. There's also an important relationship between international criminal law and the prohibition of war itself, which is manifest in the crime of aggression. And this crime emerges after the First World War, but we'll come back to it. For present purposes, what I wanted to reiterate for you was that from as early as 1863, some of the people that were involved in the creation of the International Committee of the Red Cross, which had a very much a focus on humanitarian law and mitigating the unnecessary violence against both soldiers and civilians during war. They also saw the creation of an international criminal court as essential. How else will we enforce this body of law? What other way will there be to ensure that states actually sign on and comply to this body? You can't rely on states to do it between themselves because they have an intense conflict of interest. They are an interested party. Of course, you're going to say, I went to war, but we didn't commit any atrocities. No country ever does commit any atrocities by its own admission because, it requires such commitment on the part of local populations to like a valid, laudable cause that admitting that they commit atrocities is always so antithetical to the sort of public goodwill that's requisite to send young men and women to their deaths. So no one wants to admit that, right? Now, so from the very get-go, there were a number of concerted attempts to create an international criminal court. Around 1863, when the International Committee of the Red Cross was established, there was one. There was another soon after the First World War in 1920. There were committees established with a view to creating an international criminal court. The same was true after the Second World War. In the Genocide Convention in 1950 speaks explicitly about the creation of an international criminal court in anticipation that that was sort of the next step. But one of the things that I say to people when I teach international criminal law is it's a really spectacular, monumental political achievement that in our lifetimes, this international criminal court that people had been attempting to construct for 150 years actually came into being. And again, I wanted to situate that advent in the context of two sets of arguments that I introduced you to last time. One in which is like, actually, that's not a good thing for the world because, borrowing off Schwarzenberger's piece, we just don't have the requisite constitutional structure globally to pull this off. It's way too ambitious. And because it's way too ambitious, it's making promises it can't keep. And it will always be politically instrumentalized in ways that exacerbate power imbalances in the world rather than doing anything meaningful for any type of robust concept of justice. On the one hand. On the other, well, at a minimum, it's going to prosecute people who deserve to be prosecuted for doing some awful things. And likewise, maybe it's kind of like about a progressive realization of underlying values in the same way that sort of slavery became prohibited. Maybe we'll incrementally get to a point where we're like, yeah, you know what? It's slaughtering a few too many people recently. Well, forever. That's got to stop. So there's a sort of a tension between these that emerge. But what's fascinating and I think important to your understanding is that out of a same sort of logic that still obtains today, there's a desire 150 or more years ago to be creating an international criminal court to adjudicate these disputes about violence. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about the World War I, which in my view is by far the most interesting period. Maybe my view is a little bit polluted by this. My view might be a little bit contaminated by the fact that everyone in my field seems to be fixated on Nuremberg in particular, largely playing down Tokyo, although there's some very important work on the Tokyo Tribunal that was established after the Second World War also. But everyone's pretty much fixated on Nuremberg as the point of origin, the genesis of international criminal justice. But what is so fascinating is that in very large part, Nuremberg was a reaction to what took place after the First World War, which is unsurprising in all sorts of different ways. At the end of the First World War, the Treaty of Versailles was signed as the peace agreement between Germany and the Entente. And this was an especially significant moment because, the treaty's terms were spectacularly harsh and really reduced Germany to spectacular poverty and to starvation for long periods of time. One provision in the Treaty of Versailles, though, proved most controversial, and it's hard to put oneself in this climate and to appreciate this, but the one provision that proves especially controversial is that governing war guilt. And it's especially controversial to the point that Germany will risk revolution internally and being reinvaded by the victorious army just over the fact that the Allies have asked for extradition of who they perceive to be war criminals to stand trial in France, Belgium, and Britain. And when this demand is made to the German ambassador in Paris, he resigns and refuses to deliver it to Berlin. Such is the the sense of honor and the idea that these sorts of trials would be dishonorable to people that fought in the war, and they're simply not prepared to take that dishonor. That's the first aspect. A request for several hundred German officers to be extradited to France, Belgium, and to Britain to stand trial for atrocities during the Second World War. The second element is a desire for a trial of Kaiser Wilhelm II, the German chancellor that had led Germany into war, violated Belgian independence in doing so. And this process is thought to be best achieved by an international tribunal that people hope will be created in the Netherlands. In the end, Kaiser Wilhelm lives out his days in peace, and the Dutch protect him. The Americans also protect him, saying, there's really no law. It would be retroactive criminal law to prosecute the Kaiser for international crimes. On what basis? That's unfair. What's striking about all of these sorts of things is that at Nuremberg, only a number of years later, both of those actors would adopt inverse positions. The last of the inverse positions I think is really interesting. Occurs in the figure of Winston Churchill. And after the First World War, Winston Churchill is like pro-trials. He thinks trials are a good idea, and that like summary executions and things like that, it's like, oh no, let's try these people. It's a great idea. After the whole accountability project in the First World War sort of proves itself an abysmal failure, Churchill after World War II will be, let's execute 50,000 Germans. And trials are only forced upon the Allies after the Second World War, after this two written plans to execute 50,000 Germans are leaked to the public in the United States and the public in America, in a very interesting move that I'm not sure how many parallels there are for this. But the American public says, no way, you are not going to execute 50,000 Germans. And the Allies have to back down. But what's key for the First World War is that there's a considerable enthusiasm for trials by Churchill, but it's ultimately the Americans who say, not a good idea, not a good idea. We would be creating law. Let's not do that. Everyone changes their opinion after the Second World War. So under my label failed extradition, the Germans say, no way. No way we're extraditing people. You know what we'll do? We'll try them in our own local courts. And this emerges as sort of like the epitome of the difficulty that I described earlier, for which international courts became necessary. The difficulty is that, but the courts were captured. The courts were captured by exactly the same political sentiments that had produced the atrocities in the first place. And so what they produced was sham trials. So interesting, the relationship between these trials in Leipzig and trials in absentia in France and Belgium, because basically these trials in each of these countries just amounted to a continuation of war. What would happen in France and Belgium is they tried, I think, 1,600 people within the space of 3 years in absentia, meaning they didn't have the defendant because the defendant was in Germany. And these people would be convicted in France and Germany without the accused there. The information would be sent to international newspapers and say, Frederick was convicted, and then Frederick would apply to the court in Leipzig. The German court would try him, acquit him, and then send the information back to the newspaper saying, actually, no, not so much. So that process was widely perceived as a spectacular failure, precisely because it failed to address the sort of a core structural problem that we discussed in the first instance, and that is that states that commit international crimes don't tend to be lining up to hold their own nationals responsible, especially when questions of national honor are involved. And so ultimately, British interest in the whole thing waned, and they weren't able to reassert jurisdiction after this failed Leipzig process. There were several high-profile acquittals in Leipzig that led the Belgians and French just to abandon the process. And most interesting, these trials in Leipzig applied international and German law. And so again, it's this question, what is international criminal law when they're international crimes, but they're being applied using German notions of criminal responsibility and procedure, which are radically different to things that people, especially in England, had observed previously. So let me move on here and discuss with you the Second World War. And in a way, I've already gestured at this. The second accountability after the Second World War was a very deliberate attempt to learn from the lesson of Leipzig. It was a very deliberate attempt to be reactionary. And in a way, these about turns in the history of international criminal justice happen all the time. We can see them even in the International Criminal Court in ways that I can describe in different ways, where they say, oh, the function of this institution is to write history. And at the Yugoslav tribunal, they indict Milosevic and try and write thousands and thousands of pages about the dissolution of the former Yugoslavia and this opus which tells a full story, and ultimately it becomes this maniacal thing that that doesn't survive the death of Milosevic, which is widely perceived as a huge failure. And so then, as a reaction, the International Criminal Court said, well, we're not going to do that. We'll indict Thomas Lubanga, who's like this awful warlord in the Congo and responsible for rapes and massacres and all sorts of stuff. We'll indict him on one count of using child soldiers. And then you speak to Congolese and they just, that's I get the didactic purpose of the indictment, and using child soldiers is a major problem for everyone in Africa in all warring factions with which we're familiar, and it's important that that's expressed. But what about the murder? What about this guy killing thousands of people? So some stories to say that often there are these sort of reactions and overcorrections, and that in a way we still haven't reached a point of optimal balance between some of them. World War II follows that trajectory. It's a strong and deliberate reaction to the failures of Leipzig. And from the very beginning, what's quite interesting, the Second World War is so interesting. What's interesting is that at a certain juncture, it kind of seems that the writing's on the wall about who's going to win, especially after the Battle of Stalingrad. And so, up until Stalingrad, like in France, for instance, 40% or more of France is collaborating. And largely France is a collaborating nation for the vast majority of the war. And the resistance the French resistance is a very minor phenomenon. But after Stalingrad and the writings on the wall about who's going to win, suddenly, France reimagines de Gaulle as the champion, vilifies Pétain and Vichy, and everyone makes this big shift from being full collaborators to reimagining themselves as part of the resistance, and so on and so forth. And we shouldn't be entirely surprised by that, right? People are pragmatic and they want to back the winner. The consequences of not backing the winner are spectacular, obviously. But it's interesting the story these nations tell themselves about that afterwards and the sort of ways in which denial plays an important part. At any rate, when the writing is on the wall towards the end of the war, the Allies make repeated statements publicly that prosecuting international crimes will be one of the core purposes of the continuation of the violence, that they're committed. We're saying, well, you know what? We are committed to prosecuting atrocities. And I guess the proposition or the purpose of those sorts of statements is to issue warnings, to sort of leverage deterrence. It'd be an interesting question to figure out whether that was in any way, shape, or form effective. But once the war came to an end, there was suddenly an acute problem, which we see time and time again in this field. Well, what are we going to do about the atrocities? They were spectacular in amplitude, although, note, very little consciousness of the Holocaust at that juncture. And what the primary focus is of post-World War II trials is aggression. Aggression being the criminal act of going to war in the first place. The whole atrocity paradigm based on crimes against humanity and things like this, especially for the Holocaust, will emerge much later. And so initially, the main crime in Nuremberg and in Tokyo is aggression. And it's aggression because, well, that's the act that like unleashed this entire orgy of violence against soldiers, against civilians. But for that sort of decision to launch an aggressive war, tens of millions of people would not have died. And so that's the central evil that the Nuremberg Tribunal was most concerned with. But still, there was this dilemma that I don't think necessarily features so explicitly in subsequent iterations. Well, we can discuss that vis-a-vis the Rwandan genocide. But the dilemma is, well, what are we going to do with the people responsible for the atrocities? And the answer, at least initially, after the Second World War, is we're going to execute them. We're going to make a list of 50,000 Nazis, and we're just going to shoot them. And these ideas weren't sort of like hush-hush ideas behind closed doors. These were openly discussed by leaders Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill. And Churchill, by this point, was a strong advocate for the executions because he'd seen the failure of Leipzig. And so there were two plans drawn up officially, the Simons Plan and the Morgenthau Plan. And really, Nuremberg only emerged when the Morgenthau Plan was leaked to the American public, and they were just, no way that in our name you're going to execute 50,000 people. No way. And so like, well, what are we left with? Well, we're left with doing something radically different from what we did at Leipzig. We were all this uber concerned about, the Americans were uber concerned there about like creating new law when there wasn't much available, like creating international tribunals. No, not a great idea for Kaiser Wilhelm. This time they're like, do it. And so here then is the impetus for the creation of the Nuremberg trials first, and then the Tokyo trials second, creation of an international tribunal, saying, what a crazy irony of like the Russians who like have an enormous amount of blood on their hands waltzing into a court in Nuremberg and sort of like pontificating about moral responsibility. What a crazy world we live in for that to be plausible. And even the Allies, what's interesting about the construction of denial is that you see it very intensely in the ways we narrate responsibility for the Second World War to ourselves. And so, one of the classic forms of denial is reductionism, like, oh, a few bad apples, it was a bad incident, but aberrational and not reflective of the way we held ourselves and conducted ourselves. But, like a survey soon after the Second World War suggested that 39% of Allied ordinances were deliberately directed at civilian targets out of a desire for morale bombing, quote unquote. The idea being that, if we terrorize local populations in Germany and Japan, they will stop supporting the Nazi war machine and the war will end. Well, what an expensive psychological mistake, right? Insane. Totally bananas. Because actually, if you terrorize people, what is equally likely and proved to be the case is like they'll be traumatized and double down in vindictiveness in response. And they'll fight to the death and they'll anyway, what an expensive mistake. So the firebombing of Dresden, probably people have heard about. If you don't know much about the Second World War, there may be people among you who know far more about the Second World War than me. I suspect some don't know a great deal about the Second World War, and so people will probably in that camp have heard about the firebombing of Dresden, and they'll sort of understand it as, the Allies did firebomb Dresden, but the Allies firebombed all of Germany and all of Japan, killing hundreds of thousands of people, and the death, it's like spectacularly brutal, because most people didn't sort of catch fire. Most people had their lungs explode from a vacuum that was created by this sort of self-perpetuating firestorm that was generated in the sky by hundreds of thousands of ordnance being dropped at the same time. So spectacularly brutal, and the ways in which it's just reduced to Dresden speaks to precisely the sort of denial that international criminal justice should exist to counteract. And through this story, you get your first glimpse at a descriptor which is sort of traditionally used to critique both Nuremberg and Tokyo, which is victor's justice. And so if you think of Leipzig as vanquished justice, that is justice by the German state against its own nationals, which turns out to be a total farce because we're not going to hold ourselves responsible. That's the core dilemma in international criminal justice that we announced and that persists in the global order as we understand it. Victor's justice, on the other hand, is sort of like the inverse, where the victor of the war gets to prosecute the enemy's atrocities. It's like, well, that's kind of a conflict of interest in the different way, where it's like, you're only going to prosecute one side of this, right? And I'm not suggesting moral equivalence between Allies and Germans, but that conflict of interest brushes under the carpet some spectacular offending. And that offending, in turn, is denigrated from public consciousness in ways that people don't really know that the Allies were terrorizing hundreds of thousands of people during the Second World War out of a policy that was so manifestly deplorable. And we haven't even got to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So you start to see emerging the importance of sort of an international criminal justice that is broader and wider, and the ways in which international criminal justice can be instrumentalized for particular political ends. And again, your response might be to play sort of the inverse position in the polls that I suggested to you characterize the whole field. You might still be, all of that stuff is like awful, deplorable, but still those Nazis needed to be punished. And I'd still punish Mengele if we could ever have caught him he should have been punished. So you start to see the sort of the dilemmas and the sort of the compromises and the imperfections in the way this takes place. A couple of other things that I wanted to highlight for you. So Nuremberg really was just the tip of the iceberg, and Tokyo also. In Europe, there were zonal trials. So there were trials by in national courts in French-controlled Germany, Russian-controlled Germany, English-controlled Germany, and French-controlled Germany, and that produced a whole body of cases. But broadly, criminal law, the use of criminal law to purge societies throughout Europe was massive. Like 3 to 4% of the European population was tried after the Second World War for collaboration with the enemy, for war crimes, for things of this sort. So you have to understand, I mean, 3 to 4% of the population, sort of like, it's a spectacular moment. And just very difficult to place yourself back in there and to think about what the value and effects of the use of criminal law in this sort of way were. Most of these trials involved national crimes, which again, not international crimes, which again sort of puts pressure on our definition of what is international criminal justice and why would we be so fixated on international law terminology when there are these overlapping phenomena that are doing almost exactly the same sorts of work. There is much more to say about the Second World War, but I hope that gives you a little bit of a snapshot. And I want to continue to the end of the next big war, and you'll start to notice that, oh, look at that. The history of international criminal law seems to follow the end of major global conflagrations. This one was the Cold War. And after the Cold War, the US was left as sort of the final hegemon. And that meant that it had a degree of political power that it could exercise through the UN Security Council that pretty much let it do whatever it wanted through that vehicle. And so after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, there was obviously the wars in the former Yugoslavia, and which is part and parcel of the dissolution of the socialist Yugoslav state. And so the Security Council of the United Nations suddenly decides that it will create an international criminal tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, this in 1993. Now, I'm not going to go through the UN Charter with you, but you kind of have to understand that this is a crazy, novel, intense interpretation of powers confirmed in the UN Charter. The UN Charter makes no mention whatsoever about the capacity of the Security Council to create judicial bodies. And so sort of arrogating to yourself the power to do something of that like spectacular novelty and intensity is like, whew, that's breathtaking. And I mean, we could say more about that power, about, well, is there a degree of like democratic legitimacy in that? Well, no, not really. It's sort of like the will of this dictatorial entity called the Security Council that was established to offset the failures of the League of Nations after the First World War. And, democratic credentials aren't especially strong here. Try and make it personal. So it's nice to do this in the context of Canada and Australia. So the UN decides to create an international court that prosecutes Australians and Canadians for genocide of indigenous peoples. And that institution, like the Yugoslav Tribunal, has legal superiority over national law. and take for granted the states of denial about both of those atrocities in Canada and Australia, which is sort of the hallmark of all genocides. That's just the way, again, denial is the final act of genocide. Imagine how local publics in your country would receive that. That'd be like, oh, what on earth? What insane arrogation of power and violation of basic democratic principles. Like, wild. And what's interesting about this also is there's a sense in which the creation of the tribunal by the Security Council is an apology for actually the Security Council's failures itself. The Security Council has an obligation to ensure peace and security, and in instances in the former Yugoslavia, then Rwanda soon after, it's like, well, it's a fairly spectacular failure of responsibility on your part. It's not as if you didn't know, right? So there's an interesting idea that, well, we failed miserably to discharge our responsibility, but we'll create an institution that purports to try people for failing to comply with theirs. So there's a sort of there's a moral valence to it, which is interesting and problematic. And then there's this dilemma, which emerges as a fairly key dilemma throughout the ways in which people think about the construction of institutions for international crimes. And that's the dilemma between independence and proximity. So, and in a way, this sort of represents a dilemma that pretty much all institutions will struggle with. So which side shall I describe first? Let me describe the independence side. So, after the dissolution of the former Yugoslavia and all of this like concentration camps and creative torture and it's so spectacularly disturbing. The Security Council decides to create an ad hoc international criminal tribunal in The Hague. It's like, well, that's like thousands of miles away. You imagine, like, we're going to create an international court to try the Australian genocide. We're going to set it up in Berlin. Wow. And you expect this institution to like have a connection with local people and to sort of change people's minds and to sort of promote what values? Just retribution, or are you're trying to reconcile people? Are you trying to prevent this sort of thing from happening again? Like why? What's your purpose? And like Berlin's a long way away, and that's immediately going to be greeted with tremendous resistance and skepticism because of the way it's been done. And yet the argument is, well, listen, it needs to be in Berlin because it needs to be independent. And if you put it in Canberra, it's going to be like under huge political pressure. It's like, in a lot of these sorts of states, it's sort of the collapse of rule of law and violence is omnipresent. And so there's a way in which by situating courts in places that are immediately post-violent, that you're compromising independence in the name of sort of like connection with local values. And so, you want these institutions to be independent and reach valid conclusions. You've got to put them in a place that's secure, and necessarily that will be distant. Versus arguments, but you're engaged in the most spectacularly arrogant process in the history of like the modern world, where you're expecting to be able to sort of parachute these lawyers from all over the world into our culture to investigate something and say something about responsibility. It's so, the hubris is so breathtaking that to think that you could do that and that local populations would have some ability to say, yeah, that's a meaningful process you've got there. And I find your conclusions compelling, actually, and I'm going to change my worldview and all of the sacrifices I made during the war as a consequence of the sort of this process of adjudication, which is so distant from our reality and so uninformed, seems pretty wild as a supposition. I've essentialized and intensified, I guess, the criticisms about the pole from independence and proximity. Part of the argument is, listen, if you want to have some effect on society here, you have to be here. You actually have to be here so that local people can engage. And so part of the criticism of the Yugoslav Ad Hoc Tribunal and the Rwanda Tribunal being based in Tanzania is, this is totally divorced from reality, that local populations have no point of engagement with this. And that led to a set of hybrid courts in Sierra Leone, in Cambodia, in East Timor, in Kosovo, where there were sort of partly international, partly national courts, and there was some supposition that there would be a degree of skill transfer from sort of like experienced international prosecutors would come and train local prosecutors. There'd be this melange of international law and national law, that they would exist in the context where the atrocities took place, and therefore were more exposed to local peoples, and out of some ambition for sort of reconciliation and transcendence and victim empowerment. And so the price to be paid there is like, well, in Sierra Leone, you have to mobilize 3,000 troops to render a judgment. And in Cambodia, there are very important criticisms based on the ability of the government to undermine the independence of the institution. But this is the architecture that emerges in this sort of political sweet spot. If you think this is a positive thing, it's a sweet spot. This political sweet spot between the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and September 11, 2001, where it seems like the American liberal agenda is going to play out in the world, and there's going to be more human rights and more accountability and things like that. Over that period, the United Nations spent, I should get the figure precise. I'm confident it's 13 is the number. I was going to say 17, but the United Nations spent 13% of its entire budget on 2 ad hoc tribunals, one for the former Yugoslavia and one for Rwanda, and spent 4% of its budget on human rights for the rest of the world. People say, that's backwards. That's bonkers. If you're doing more about human rights, you wouldn't have had these like spectacular atrocities, and like so expensive to have these international tribunals. An inverse perspective, I guess, on the cost of them is that, these tribunals cost less than the Tokyo Fire Department in any given year. And they created an entire generation of lawyers who were involved with a brave new project that was attempting to leverage human rights performance in new ways, when, as people who were sort of at the helm of this human rights project beforehand, there was literally nothing, they say, happening of this magnitude prior to the ICTY. And so again, there's sort of diametric ways to think about the importance of the investment made in international criminal justice around the time, and how to emerge from it. I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes talking to you about the International Criminal Court, just to give you an overview before we terminate for today. We will have an opportunity to talk much more about the International Criminal Court at the back end, but there are various things that are really quite significant about the International Criminal Court. So, Leipzig was a process forced on the Germans. The Germans do it themselves, but they do an awful job deliberately. The Second World War, it's one of the warring sides to the conflict, tries people afterwards, which is an obvious conflict of interest, and people immediately criticize as victor's justice. The ad hoc tribunals are significant developments because there is at least a third party that's involved in adjudicating, the United Nations, that's involved in adjudicating atrocities, and that creates the possibility for the first time of thinking of these institutions as vehicles for reconciliation. But then a very significant moment comes where instead of establishing an international criminal court by the UN Security Council, one would be established by treaty, whereby states who want to be involved in an international criminal court get to sign and ratify and to commit their allegiance. And the International Criminal Court is significant because 120 odd states have been prepared to do that, but many of the most political and populous states have not. So China, the United States, Pakistan, India, Russia are not party to the ICC statute, and therefore, in a sort of if you think of this in sort of like a Martian coming down to Earth and looking at the constitution of the world and the role of the International Criminal Court within it, Martians say, well, that's bizarre. They seem like they've been committing a few. But the significant shift I want to sort of insist upon is the role of treaty as a constitutive component in the creation of the international criminal law, which is separate from all of the other processes, and which gives to the International Criminal Court a prospective jurisdiction. By prospective jurisdiction, I mean it suddenly has the ability to prosecute atrocities that are taking place while the court is in existence, as distinct from all of the others, which are created ex post facto, and that creates new and interesting dynamics and problems. In terms of structure, there's an idea that the International Criminal Court will replicate Leipzig. And by that I mean the first bite at the cherry, the first bite at the accountability goes to national states. So if you are in the United States and you've been systematically torturing people, then the first opportunity for accountability is American. And it's only really when national courts are unwilling or unable to bring these sorts of cases does the International Criminal Court step in, if it has jurisdiction, and then and only then is there a possibility for bringing a suit in the International Criminal Court. So it serves this sort of auxiliary purpose as a backup mechanism for when national cases have failed, and that concept goes under the rubric of a notion called complementarity. I won't say more about le procureur est fatigué, except that it was a slogan mentioned to me by Congolese friends when I worked there, who just perceived the court as way too slow, doing way too little, and just a really immense confusion about like why this lofty rhetoric and such poor performance. And we can talk about different explanations for that. Again, the dynamic of international law and national law will not escape us, nor will this question about political instrumentalization on the one hand versus, yeah, that's unfortunate, but still the moral accountability is worth it in some instances, and a broader array of critiques about how this system now functions globally. I'm going to stop this lecture now. I hope I've put on the table enough that sort of gives you a meaningful information from which we can have an interesting discussion about these points now. Okay, thanks so much.